You are listening to Accents, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. I'm your host, Katerina Stoikova, and my guest is fiction writer Stephen Carter. Hi, Steve, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Very too happy to have you on the show. We spoke recently, I think it was at the end of last year.
Yes, it was. Last
Yeah.
day, actually.
Was
hmm
it really? The 31st of January. Cool.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, it's an honor to finish the year with you.
Well, thank you.
What have you been writing?
I've been working on a novel. Um, I've, I guess in that space of time, I've rewritten about the first quarter of it. Um, and yeah, that's what I'm doing. Novel I've been working on for a while.
Has the pandemic been good for your writing?
uh, I don't know if it's changed anything that much, except there for, I don't know, 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. I couldn't write because I had to spend so much time on my job. Um, getting things arranged there. I'm a teacher, and I had to put 4 classes online really quickly. So, but after I got that done, I got back to it.
Okay, so what will you read for us?
This is a short story called "The Winner." Uh, I actually wrote it my last year in graduate school, and it's always been one of my favorite of my stories. And it's one of the few from that time that was actually halfway decent, I think. Uh, and I haven't had to rewrite much. So, um, called
I'd
The
like to
Winner.
hear it.
Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Okay, The Winner. When Grierson came in through the alley door, bringing with him a wave of air as cold as misery, the poker game had already been in progress for an hour. The three men sitting at the table looked up at Grierson as if surprised, whether by his appearance in the room or the sudden cold, it was impossible to tell. But then Ham and Earl nodded and said hello, scooted their chairs over to make a place at the table. Wabi didn't bother to speak. He just kept looking at his cards. Grierson brushed the snow off his overcoat and hung it on a nail, then sat down to watch them finish the hand. It was 7-card stud, Wabi dealing, and the pot was still small, a few coins and one damp, wrinkled dollar bill. Langley was sitting across the room at a wood school desk between the filing cabinet and the heating stove, his white dress shirt buttoned to the collar. It was Langley who had telephoned Grierson and invited him to the game. So this was his first time playing. The other men were all older than him and had been his father's friends when his father was alive, and up until his death in a roof fall 6 years ago, Grierson's father had played in this same poker game every Thursday night. It was held at Langley's hardware store back in the large storage room. It was a cluttered place with crates of this and that scattered everywhere and cans of paint stacked against the walls like grocery store soup. Langley himself no longer played, could no longer see well enough to. The old man's face was so wrinkled it seemed to be constructed of petals, like a pink rose, and his eyes were the color of worn pennies. All he could do now during the poker game was sit in the desk with a bottle of whiskey in front of him and, on cold nights such as this one, stoke the fire with coal. The ante's 50 cents, Wabi said. He had won the last hand on a bluff and was now dealing the new one. He looked at Grierson. You didn't ante but a quarter, he said. Grierson counted the pot and then added another quarter. I thought I put in 2, he said. He scooted his chair closer to the table. Last time I played was about a year ago. We started at $2 apiece, he said. Had some pretty good stakes. Where was that? Wabi asked. San Antonio. Wabi finished dealing and put down the deck of cards. He smiled and looked around the table. Tell me, boys, are we in San Antonio? I don't think it's San Antonio. I didn't mean anything, Grierson said. No, not San Antonio, Earl said. He had a queen showing, so he started the betting by pushing $1 into the pot. Grierson had just returned to his hometown to Midnight after 12 years in the Air Force. He had joined right after high school with the sketchy idea that someday and somehow, even though he wore glasses and hadn't been to college, he would become a pilot. That he'd be streaking above small towns like this one, rattling window panes and chinaware. But when he finally quit, he was spending his days in an airplane hangar that had been converted to a warehouse in San Antonio, with his title staff sergeant in charge of excess property. And when he came home, he took a job as second supervisor in charge of inventory for the Altasia Coal Company. 3 months after his return, Grierson married the woman who served him his breakfast every morning at the Triangle Diner, Etta. She was wiry and quiet, well past 30, and had brown eyes that always looked sleepy. She said no more than she had to in the diner, unlike the other waitresses who kept up a harmless, flirtatious chatter with the regulars. But Grierson noticed that sometimes as Etta walked away from a table, her ponytail swaying, the men would exchange glances, and he saw that her tips were usually more than they needed to be. Then one Friday, when he unrolled his silverware, there was a phone number written inside the paper napkin, and that night he called. The first 2 times, she made him pay like everyone else. Then it was different, but he wasn't sure why. He didn't ask. Then one Sunday, he woke up in her bed, hungover, and she was standing beside him, holding a cup of coffee and wearing a high-collared navy blue dress and black spike heels, a bright red toenail showing in the toe of each. She wanted to go to church, then out to eat. They arrived late, and Grierson walked her down the aisle in the middle of the second hymn, looking straight ahead. He could hear the whispers under the organ music. Later that week, he parked in front of the diner one morning just after dawn and flashed his headlights at the plate glass window. Inside, Etta was taking orders from Wabi and Earl, who were sitting at the same table. When Wabi saw the lights, he leaned over the table and stared out at Grierson and stayed that way until Etta started for the door. Then he said something to Earl and laughed and went back to his coffee. In the car, Etta took a leather cigarette case from the large pocket on her smock and snapped it open. "I can't talk long," she said. "I've got 6 tables going." "Do you like me?" Grierson said. He sat with one hand on the steering wheel, looking through the windshield. Behind the diner, a dull sun had topped the ridge and appeared to be balanced on the tree line like a white ball. "Yes, I do," she said after a time. "Enough to quit?" Etta cracked her window and let out a mouthful of smoke. "Quitting's fine with me," she said, "as long as there's something to quit for." That weekend, they drove to Gatlinburg and were married in a 24-hour chapel, then spent the night at Holiday Inn. But since then, although Etta put hot meals on the table and kept the house spotless, all of which pleased Grierson, it seemed to be an effort for her to twist her head off the pillow and kiss him goodnight. Grierson won over $16 the first hand he played, with a pair of aces showing. Then for the next several hands, he received decent cards, just missed a full house in one and a heart flush in another. But after a quick hour of playing, he was $33 in the hole. Wabi was still dealing, and for some reason, Grierson suspected he was giving him the cards he wanted him to have, that by being given good cards early in a hand, he was being suckered into staying in the pot. Ham and Earl had been holding off on any big bets until the last 2 cards, and no one had tried to steal a pot early. Grierson wondered if he had been invited to the game so he could be taken, or if he was just imagining that he was being taken. He arranged his money into neat stacks near the edge of the table, a smooth-worn square of plywood nailed to 2 sawhorses, with the idea some order might change his luck. "Doesn't the deal ever pass?" he asked no one in particular. "I've always done it," Wabi said. "I see," Grierson said. "I'm better at it, quicker," Wabi said. "No problem with that, is there?" With a Barlow pocket knife, he cut the seal on a fresh pack of cards. No problem with that," Grierson said. He fixed his quarters so the edges were even. "I could just use some new luck, that's all." Wabi smiled. He watched the cards arch and fall between his hands as he began to shuffle. He was stocky, with a head like a tree stump, and wore a gray suit vest buttoned tightly over his round stomach. He was called Wabi because his left leg was artificial from the knee down, the result of a tractor accident when he was 11, and since he couldn't afford the artificial limb until he was 20 and had used a crutch all those years, his left arm and shoulder were much bigger than his right, and gave him the appearance of always being ready to topple to one side. No one used his real name anymore. You'll get your luck when it decides to come, Wabi said, just like the rest of us. He started the deal to his left. I suppose, Grierson said. Poker's a streaky thing, Earl said, and there ain't nothing you can do about it except sit there and wait. He smiled a little and pulled cigarettes from the breast pocket of his grease-spotted orange jumpsuit. I've always said that. So'd your daddy, too. Don't cheat that boy, laughed Langley from across the room. He took a drink of whiskey and his lips made a sucking noise as they separated from the bottle. I didn't get him down here so you could cheat him. This embarrassed Grierson, made him feel like a child. I'm all right, he said. This is a friendly game, Ham said. Everybody knows that. Ham was tall and thin and had a nervous manner that made all his gestures and expressions seem palsied. He lifted the corner of his first card and peered underneath, his hand trembling slightly. Sometimes it just takes a while to get rolling, he said. Langley shifted in his desk and it made a short squeak like chalk on a blackboard. Just watch your steps, son, he said. I didn't get you down here so you could hand your shirt to these birds. Wabi stopped dealing. Just what were you thinking, A.V.? You know he's got to give it to somebody. The men, Grierson included, laughed. Well, Langley said, take you another drink. What it is that I know he just got back to town, just got married. And it's a good thing to get out, that's all. Ham had a jack showing, so he started the betting by putting 3/4 into the pot. The others followed. How's old Etta doing, Wabi said as he handed out the next round of cards. I'll have to say she's missed down at the diner. I hear it talked every morning. She ought to get out more. Come down and say hello sometime. Wabi and Grierson looked at each other. Grierson felt his face turning color. He pushed his glasses up on his nose. But it's none of my business anyway, Wabi said. Not my wife. He reached the oversized arm behind him to scratch his back, and it looked like a stovepipe bending out of his body. I wouldn't know about wives, he said. Never been married. She's fine where she is, Grierson said. I'm sure, Wabi said. Earl dropped his cigarette on the dark concrete floor and twisted it out with his shoe. By the time the 11 o'clock horn blew, signaling the change of shift at the mines, it came to them faintly like the murmur of a far-off train. Grierson had $30 and some change left from his original 100. He was now sure he was being taken. There was no evidence, nothing he could point to. He just knew it the same way he knew when a friend told him a lie. But he also believed it would be more of a loss to be run out of this poker game than to stay and lose his last nickel. That if he quit now, it would be like skulking away from his fist fight, not because he knew it was foolish to fight, but simply because he knew he would be beaten. Grierson had always been like this. He had re-enlisted twice in the Air Force, although he had known after the first 2 weeks of basic that it wasn't for him, and that he had about as much chance of being a pilot as a blind man. He pulled the last of his money from the stiff bank envelope and laid it on the table. It was all in ones. The room was now sweltering, but it didn't seem to bother the other men, and Langley even had the stove open and was feeding it more coal. Grierson undid his cuff buttons and rolled up his sleeves. From where he sat, the inside of the stove appeared as a dark square glowing red, and as each lump of coal knocked into it, sparks jumped out and died to the floor. Last couple of hands for me, Ham said, squinting and rubbing his eyes. I go back on in the morning. Ham was a blaster. Often he had worked the same crew as Grierson's father. When Grierson was a child, his father told him that Ham could shake like a leaf all day, but when it came time to set a charge, his hands were as still as a dead man's. Me likewise, Earl said. I'm about through. A couple of hands is all I need, Grierson said. It's getting ready to turn for me. He laughed, but it sounded hollow and forced, and he wondered if it sounded the same to the others. Langley clanked shut the stove door. Don't walk out with nothing, he said. Hell, A.V., Earl said. I've gone 6 months and never left with as much as I carried in. You getting bad rums, Ham added. Wabi said nothing. He started the deal. He had been quiet for a good while, and for the past hour he had been drinking from a pint bottle he'd produced from his coat pocket. The whiskey had given his face color, and sweat shone on his forehead and upper lip, but his hands still seemed sure with the cards. King high bets, Wabi said to Grierson. And Grierson had another king in the hole. This is what had happened all night. Good cards early in the hand. King's good for 5, he said, counting the money into the pot. Shit, Earl said. He had his hand on his money. I don't know. Go on, stay the hell in, Wabi said, and his voice was bright, loud from the alcohol. Everyone did stay in, and by the time the 6th card was dealt, Gerson had 4 kings, 2 of them showing, and had bet all his money except for $3. And although he was surprised no one had folded, he was again thinking that perhaps he wasn't being cheated. All that could beat him were aces, and he didn't think even Wabi would be that obvious. He pushed the $3 into the pot. Earl followed with a shrug. But Ham hesitated, the money poised in his hand over the table. He stared at the pot, which was well over $100, and his eyebrows twitched. Come on and do something, Earl said. With his fingernail, he picked at something in his teeth. I'm in, Ham said, and dropped the money. I'll see 3, Wabi said, his voice with that same bright and chaotic quality, and raised 2. Grisham tore the flat from the bank envelope, and with a pen from his shirt pocket began writing his name and $2 on the scrap of paper. Don't take markers, Wabi said. You either got the money or you don't. I'm good for it, Grisham said. You are, Wabi said, but it doesn't make any difference. Here, Langley said. His wallet was on the desk, and he was holding out the $2. Let him take this, he said. He didn't know. Why should we, Wabi said. He's no better than us. He's got to play the same rules. He began laughing. It was a taunting laughter, the kind that accompanies the banter before a schoolyard fight. He said he might have had that money if he weren't probably paying to get into his own house every night, but that's nothing. You'd have to take a plane to find somebody who hadn't handed Etta a few dollars. And when he stopped, he was sitting on the edge of his chair and staring at Grierson with eyes that were small, red in the corners. Even as Grierson was rising and making the fist, he saw Wabi standing and the oversized arm swinging up and towards him in slow motion, though it happened in an instant. And the arm seemed to grow enormous the closer it got, the way things do in cartoons. And in the corners of his vision, Ham and Earl jumped back from the table as if on opposite ends of a spring. And then the arm stopped short of a punch, and Wabi was gripping Grierson's throat as if the fingers were teeth. And they were leaning across the table, their heads meeting at the top of a triangle. You shouldn't have taken her, you son of a bitch, Wabi said. His fingers tightened on Grierson's throat. There's some, that's all they got to. He stopped short, shaking his head. The damn bitch. Grierson began to struggle. He twisted and lifted and pushed at the arm with both hands without success, and Wabi didn't seem to want to hit him, but only to hold him in a grip which was immovable but just short of choking. Grierson's glasses fell to the table. To his left, Ham was crouching, making as if to spring, and then Earl yelled something, and then it was Langley lifting the pistol from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and standing in front of the school desk. The pistol was old and heavy and looked as big as a boot in the old man's hand. Grierson stopped and turned his head as much as he could, as did Wabi. And although he loosened his grip, it wasn't enough for Grierson to pull free. Langley took 2 shuffling steps forward with the pistol hanging in his right hand at his side. Stop, he said. But he shouldn't have, Wabi said. Stop, Langley said again. No more, let him go. He raised the pistol until the long, old blue barrel was pointing straight up. His hand shook, then it steadied. Then he fired one shot that cut through the high stamped tin ceiling with a loud ping. At once the air smelled of the explosion. Wabi let him go. Now, Langley said, waving the pistol in Grierson's direction, you get as much money off the table as you had when you started. I don't care what happened. We're going back to scratch. We'll start from there, and that'll be the end of it. Grierson looked at him. Go on, he said, get it. Grierson went around the table and put on his coat. Then he started counting money out of the pot, 1s and 5s mostly, and stuffing the bills into his coat pockets. Wabi moved past him to a corner and sat on a stack of crates. He took a drink from his pint and stared at the floor. Langley sat down and laid the pistol on the desk, and Ham and Earl stood at the stove with their backs to the table, whispering. As Grierson collected the last of what was his, he took a quick look around the room. Then, because he wanted to know, in fact, had to know, what would have happened if things had run their course, he turned everyone's cards face up. He found that Ham had been bluffing and was a card short of a club flush, while Earl had 3 jacks. Wabi had a pair of 8s. Grierson had turned out of the alley and was walking down the town's one long street, rubbing his Adam's apple where it felt bruised and full as if he had swallowed a marble, when he realized he'd forgotten his glasses. He just needed them for seeing up close, and he had another pair at home. So he decided not to go back, but not because he was afraid or embarrassed, and strangely, he didn't feel something awful had just happened. He had his money after all, and he hadn't expected to. It was still snowing, and compared to the stuffiness of the room, the cold air felt good. With each step, his shoe disappeared crisply into the snow, and the flakes tickled his face as he walked into them. He passed under the protruding V of the theater marquee, although the theater was now used as a church, and then he went past the bluish lights of the new chain grocery. A tall pickup was skidding around the parking lot trying for figure eights. Then he left the town proper. He was still on the same street, but here it was lined on both sides for a quarter mile with identical cracker box houses built in the 40s by the coal company that had then owned most of the town. The houses all had wood siding, but were painted a variety of colors. The one he had grown up in was red, and the one he bought when he moved back was a pale green. Steep hills backed the houses and made them look as if they were built on opposite sides of a tunnel. And now, as he often liked to do at night, as he had done since childhood, he walked looking to one side and watched the rooftops of the houses describe a perfect shadowy zigzag. He entered his house through the kitchen door. He thought to knock the snow off his shoes on the linoleum floor there, then made his way in the dark through the living room and on into the bedroom. Etta had left on the dresser lamp a frilly shaded thing, and it cast a weak gray light through the room. She was curled into a ball facing the center of the bed. Grierson could see nothing of her but her forehead and closed eyes, her long brown hair on top of the quilt. He stood at the foot of the bed a moment and watched her sleep. Then he stepped over and sat down in the chair where he put on his shoes every morning and leaned his head back against the wall. "I hope that's you," Etta said through the muffle of the covers. She turned over to face him. "I didn't mean to wake you." "It's all right." She rubbed an eyelash from the corner between her eye and nose. "Is it still snowing?" "Uh-huh, it's pretty. So did you win?" Grierson unbuttoned the top button of his coat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of money. "A lot more than I walked in with," he lied. Etta rolled over and smiled at the ceiling. "Good," she said. "I don't like those men." Grierson replaced the money and started unbuttoning his coat again. "I don't either," he said. "Not very much anyway, but I guess I'll keep playing cards with them. I guess they're going to be my friends." "No one's making you go back," she said. Grierson didn't answer her. He finished undressing and left his clothes on the chair, turned off the light, and climbed under the covers. He scooted across the mattress until he was up against Etta's back, and as he spoke, his lips brushed her ear. "Why don't we go up to Middlesboro tomorrow and eat at that steakhouse you like," he said. "Then we'll find something else to spend the rest of it on. Maybe stay the night. How does that sound?" "Fine," she said, "but the road probably won't be clear tomorrow." "Then the first day it is," Grierson said. He let his arm fall loosely over her. "Yes, of course," she said. She found his hand. That's it.
Wow, that was beautiful. A beautiful story of redemption and love, and with all its complexity. I loved it.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just remembering that when I interviewed you on Accents last, you brought a story in which the character was questioning whether he's being told the truth or not, or whether there is more. So do you often write about doubts and the characters questioning themselves?
I'd never thought about it before, but I guess to some degree, not always, but I guess I do sometimes. I mean, sometimes knowing, um, knowing what you can know can be difficult. I guess not.
Right?
I
Right.
mean, that's sort of a funny way to put it, but it's I mean, often we don't even know what we think ourselves, so it can be difficult to know what other people really. All we have to go on is what they do and say, and that's a lot. But that's not always honest either.
And even ourselves as writers, how do we know what we think until we write about it?
Yeah.
Well, I hope that your characters had a nice getaway after the roads were cleared and spent a very good evening together. I'm
I
rooting
hope
for
so
them.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always thought that story had basically a good ending,
Yes.
and they probably would be okay in the long run.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I was worried there for a while, and I'm so glad that you wrote
Yeah,
it
me
the way
too.
you wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the story I like best. For a decent ending is earned by the characters instead of some decent endings are just kind of tacked on. But
Well, it made sense. It was logical and surprising at the same time, and at the same time, I breathed a sigh of relief for the way it turned out. So
yeah.
I appreciate it, and thank you so much for reading it on Accents.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.